everybody in the world.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And before we get into our second segment of the day, I do want to remind you that if throughout the show you feel so inclined to either leave a tip or donation or have a question, comment, or concern you want to put in the comments section, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube or our website, gsmcpodcast.net, as you can see on the ticker right there on my screen. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. It just makes it that much better. I love hearing your guys' opinions, and I love getting them on air as well. But without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of today's show. And let's talk about some players you might want to avoid in your fantasy playoffs, because these players, while not necessarily going to be as monitored throughout the fantasy postseason, they definitely still could hold merit to certain people and certain owners in certain situations especially. But I'm here to tell you that sometimes you just can't take the risk. And I feel like this is going to be a very matchups-oriented fantasy playoffs. We're going to have to pick and choose your moments where certain players either are guaranteed starters or are not. And it's going to be difficult in some situations because this is crunch time for a lot of these playoff hopefuls here. So you never really know who's going to be viable week in, week out. But ultimately, these are the guys this week that you just don't want to risk because it's the first round of the fantasy playoffs and the stakes are too high. Without further ado, let's talk about them. Starting off with a pretty obvious one at QB. I'm not necessarily certain many people in terms of fantasy playoff hopefuls have this guy still on their roster, but they do, and they're in, say, a deeper league where he could potentially be either a QB2 or a flex option. This is where you shy away from him in this matchup. Anthony Richardson. This is not an indictment of the guy. I still think he has fantastic potential to be something in the NFL. It's just that A, we have a very small sample size of what he looks like in this league, and B, he's in a very interesting matchup, right? We're going to talk about this one a little bit more in depth in our next segment against the Broncos. Both these teams still fighting for their playoff lives in the AFC. When I look at both of these teams, I think that this defense is the difference for Denver, and that's why I'm a little concerned about Anthony Richardson in this one. And I know a lot of people are already saying, well, I'm probably not going to start him anyways, or he's most likely, if he is going to start, going to be a flex option for me. Don't even take that risk, because Anthony Richardson, as much as I love him, he's too boom or bust, and he's too unreliable in these situations. And it's going to come to a head in a very important matchup for Indianapolis. I just feel like this Indianapolis Colts team is not quite a playoff team. There have been glimpses of what they can be, but right now, they're going to prove that I feel they're 1 or 2 seasons away from truly being at least a wild card contender in the AFC. I do think they're incredibly coached, and I love what Shane Steichen is able to do with Anthony Richardson, but I do think that they need to continue to develop him. They need to continue to see positives out of his gameplay. And right now, there have been a little bit, but there haven't been enough to show me that he can be consistent in both real life and in fantasy. That's why I say shy away from him in this particular matchup. And then in terms of the running back position, this has been a guy who's kind of been popular in terms of waiver wire additions over the past couple of weeks because he has looked pretty bright these past couple of games. But I do think in this very weird matchup for the Bengals against a Titans squad that I highly appreciate in terms of the defensive side of football, I think Chase Brown is going to see a little bit of a decline in form. Now, I do think that right now he is the best running back that the Bengals have. And it is kind of no coincidence that Zach Moss is hurt, so he's kind of forced to be. But I do think that when we compare both him and Moss, there's a lot more explosiveness in this Bengals offense with Chase Brown in it, and it opens up a lot for Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and different receivers in this pass game. And so the reason why I think that this is an opportunity to kind of sell Chase Brown high is because this Titans defense can play spoiler to not just teams in the playoff race, but teams like the Bengals, who are too over-reliant on offense. They kind of got away with it against Dallas as well, where Chase Brown had arguably his best game of the season. But in this matchup, I feel that this Titans defense can keep it much closer than people expect. And I said as much when I put them in my defensive rankings for this week. So that's why I think that this is going to be a tough situation for Chase Brown, because as much as they like him, based off all the hype he's been generating these past couple of weeks, and whether or not you've gotten him off the waiver wire, I still think that this matchup is not going to be an easy sledding for Chase Brown right now, because I truly believe this Titans defense is legitimate, and I hope they invest in it enough that in the long-term future, we see major improvements from this overall squad. So that's why I feel like Chase Brown right now is not necessarily going to be a viable option for your first-round matchup. Then the wide receiver position. This may surprise some people, but I do think this is arguably a very tough matchup for this particular guy in Mike Evans. Now, I do believe that this Bucs-Chargers game could see a lot of points from both offenses, because both of these quarterbacks, Baker Mayfield and Justin Herbert, are highly capable of playing swashbuckling styles of football. But the reason why I think this is going to be a tough out for Mike Evans here is because of the depth of this Chargers secondary. We mentioned this in our Shadow Report this week, where I pinpointed the fact that Mike Evans and Cam Hart will most likely be isolated one-on-one. And Cam Hart most likely won't have much help. The fact that I don't necessarily believe that will be the one-on-one matchup throughout the entirety of this game proves to me the depth that the Chargers rely upon in the secondary to account for whatever your offense throws at them. They've had very limited success against high-powered offenses, and I'm not necessarily saying the Bucs are one, but they certainly can be when they're in the mood. But ultimately, I feel like Mike Evans is going to have a tough situation with how the Chargers defend him with so many different players that he could be quiet, surprisingly so. And I do think the Bucs have the talent needed to step up if he's been quiet in this game. But ultimately, I do feel like this is a risky take here, but it could be legitimate based off what I've seen from the Chargers defense this season. So make of that what you will. I still think a lot of you will want to roster him because he is still an elite, consistent wide receiver in that regard. But I do think this could be a very tough test for him. And I do think there's merit there in kind of hyping up this Chargers defense because they deserve it. They have proven time and time again that they are a very tough out for certain teams. And that's why the Bucs are playing with house money right now. I just don't necessarily see a good game for many Bucs receivers. And maybe not just Mike Evans. This could be a tough defensive slugfest, and it will come down to the play of both of these quarterbacks. But that's my take here on Mike Evans for this game. In terms of the tight end position, this is a guy who we talked about a little bit in this past segment, but we're going to have to highlight him in a negative manner now, Pat Freiermuth. And this is no indictment of him either, but I do think that, like I said, Russell Wilson is not too reliant in short to intermediate range in terms of middle of the field targets. I do feel like he's still, no matter what's up with Pickens, is going to want to push it down the field. And he has developed a rapport with players outside of Pickens, like Calvin Austin, like, other players on this roster. But I do think that Pat Freiermuth has kind of gone a little bit too understated in this offense. Granted, he is a very potent red zone threat, and that could be the difference in this game against the Eagles, where I do believe that red zone touchdowns will be very hard to come by based off the play of these two defenses. But I do feel like Pat Freiermuth is not going to see many touches in this game, even if George Pickens doesn't play because he's still dealing with that little injury that he's had. But ultimately, look for Pat Freiermuth to be kind of a disappointment here in this matchup. As much as I love him in this Pittsburgh offense and what his importance could mean for the prospects of Pittsburgh come postseason time, I just don't think him and Russ are gelling right now. In certain situations, they could be. But right now, it's not really coalescing to the point where it's a reliable connection in this offense. They could prove me wrong in the playoffs, but right now, I need to see more out of it to compel me to say that Pat Freiermuth could be an asset, not a detriment to your fantasy playoff team. And then last but not least, in terms of defense, this one is a pretty easy one as well. The Saints defense, which actually did a very admirable job against the New York Giants, but then again, it's the New York Giants, and they're going to go up against a very ticked-off Commanders team coming off a bye after a kind of shaky run of form there, where they lost to a couple potential playoff teams they'll be facing yet again in the playoffs. So this one's going to be all hands on deck for the Saints trying to stop this high-powered Washington offense. And yes, a lot of people might say, well, that little run of form the Commanders had before their bye is indicative of the quote-unquote Cliff Kingsbury offensive collapse, where ultimately Cliff Kingsbury offenses look pretty hot to start the year but then crumble because they can't necessarily sustain it. I do think that this Washington Commanders offense is sustainable. They just got over these past couple of weeks. They really did not execute well in those games against these top contenders. Most of all, they weren't their efficient selves. And Pittsburgh and Philly were able to disrupt that, but then they got right against Tennessee. They're coming off the bye now, and they're probably foaming at the mouth against a Saints team that really has looked bright under Darren Rizzi, but haven't necessarily seen as complex an offense as what Washington can throw at them. So that's why the Saints defense, even though you probably don't even think about them in terms of a playoff perspective, are my favorite sit of the week. Let me know what you think in the comments, because ultimately it's harder to determine who sits than who starts, just because you already know at this point who you're most likely going to put on your bench. But ultimately, it's still a fun thing to talk about, because you might have these leftover guys who you don't know what to do with and might want to throw out there to see what they're about, but it's the playoffs. So you have to think like it's crunch time rather than try and decipher how to put certain guys into your lineup week in, week out to conclude the season. But let me know what you think about this in the comments. Coming up next, we talk about the biggest stakes for certain NFL games from a fantasy standpoint. A lot of exciting ones to talk about. A lot of underrated ones as well. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about them.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk with